Okay, kids may be dismissed to go work on their Christmas program. And everyone else, please turn with me to the book of Matthew, chapter 16. Hopefully you've been reading through Matthew this week. And certainly as you're considering the book of Matthew, this is a passage that cannot be ignored. And so we want to take a look at it this morning. Now, as we get started, I'm going to ask this question. How important is your identity? Really important, right? I mean, you do a lot to protect your identity nowadays so that nobody can steal your identity, because people will do it. And, I had the bank call me one day a few years ago and said, someone is in Costa Rica trying to use your card to get a motel room, and they said, we know you were just in the bank, so we know you're not in Costa Rica. So, it's important that you protect your identity. It's important that you know something about people, right? I mean, we've got all kinds of candidates running for office right now. You need to know something about those people, so when you go to vote on Tuesday, you know who you're voting for. That's important. And so make sure you go and vote, but realize what you're voting for and who you're voting for may be more important than the what, if you know who. Identity is important. Identity is tremendously important. And we can't recognize leaders if we don't know what they stand for. And so Jesus has been trying to let everybody know who he is, all right? In the parallel account, we're looking at Matthew 16, but in the parallel account in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus has already fed the 4,000. He's been challenged by the Philistines. He's trying to teach the apostles, and they don't understand what he's trying to teach them. He heals the blind man at Bethsaida, and now he's come to Caesarea Philippi. And that's where we pick up in Matthew chapter 16. Then starting at verse 13, let's read. Now when Jesus came into the district of Caesarea Philippi, he was asking his disciples, who do people say that the Son of Man is? And they said, some say John the Baptist, and others Elijah, but still others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, but who do you say that I am? And Simon Peter answered, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said to him, blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, because flesh and blood did not reveal this to you, but my Father who is in heaven. I also say to you that you are Peter, and upon this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades will not overpower it. I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. And then he warned the disciples that they should tell no one that he was the Christ. And from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed and raised on the third day. And then jump down to verse 24. And he says, then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. All right, so very important passage. And we need to understand a little bit about the background here. Jesus is asking, who do people say that I am? Now, we need to understand the background. So, this is a picture of Caesarea Philippi. Caesarea is located on the southwestern slope of Mount Hermon. It's about 25 miles north of the Sea of Galilee, in the northernmost part of Israel. And this is the place Jesus came to ask these questions about who do people say he is, and who do you say that I am? And this is an important background to be understood. It's on a terrace about 1,150 feet above sea level, so it's overlooking a very fertile valley, and the area is scattered with ancient temples to Baal, the god of the Syrians. Now, nearby Caesarea is a cave that the Greeks considered to be the birthplace of Pan, the god of nature. Now, the original name of Caesarea was Panis, in honor of the god Pan. Today, if you were to go in that area, the name of the city is Banis, which is an Arab corruption of the Greek name Panis. Now here, Herod the Great built a great white marble temple to honor Augustus Caesar and the godhead of the Caesars, because they considered Caesar to be a god. Later, Philip would enlarge the city in honor of Tiberius Caesar. Thus, he changed the name Panis to Caesarea in honor of the Caesars, and Philippi in honor of himself. All right, now, on the sides of this mountain, you can see different little niches, and let's get the next slide and see them maybe even a little better. These different niches were in the side of the mountain, and in those little niches they would place statues or idols in honor of the different gods that they were worshiping. So this is the area Jesus has brought his disciples to ask, who do people say that I am? Now, also near this site, right close by, are two sources of water. This one comes out of the cave of Pan. And it's one of those sources. And then this is the Banis waterfall. These two sources together give us, the next slide please, the Jordan River, which was the lifeblood of Israel. That river provided the water that they needed. Now, get the picture, but that's why I wanted to show you all these pictures. I want you to get where Jesus is when he looks at his disciples and says, who do people say that I am? He's in the midst of the capital of paganism. All kinds of idolatry and false gods being worshipped, and the idea of various sources of life flowing out of this particular area. And we get to that point, Jesus wants to establish his identity. He needs to establish his identity, especially with his apostles. And so first he asks, who do people say that I am? And we all know the answer. Some say you're John the Baptist, others say you're Elijah, or maybe one of the prophets. Herod often thought Jesus was John the Baptist. R.C. Foster wrote that Herod identified Jesus with John the Baptist because of his guilty conscience for beheading John. But some people say, well, no, you're Elijah. Okay? Actually, John the Baptist was the one that came in the spirit power of Elijah. That was prophesied in the Old Testament as well. Now, so Jesus wasn't Elijah, and he wasn't John the Baptist. And other people say, well, no, you're one of the prophets. Now we're getting closer. We're getting closer. Because back in Deuteronomy, Moses said, God will raise up a prophet like unto myself, and you should listen to him. That was a prophecy about Jesus. Jesus was indeed one of the prophets. But he was much more than one of the prophets. And that's the point he's trying to get across. And you would think if people recognized that he was a prophet, wouldn't you think they would listen to him a little bit better? But we know they didn't always listen, and even the 12 that were the closest to him didn't always listen to what Jesus had to say. And so we think about popular opinion today. How do people today Look at Jesus. Well, people today say, well, he was a good teacher. And yes, he was. He was a great teacher. But he was way more than a teacher. Some people say, well, he was an imposter. That he was crazy. He was a lunatic. Well, if he had just gone to the cross and died, I might would agree with him. But he did more than just die, didn't he? He came back to life. He rose from the dead. So he's not a lunatic. He knew what he was doing. Not a lunatic. He's more than a teacher. And today, people say, well, he was just a fictional character. And there's no proof that he ever lived. Well, whoa, you better back up. You better read Roman history and Jewish history and find out there's lots of proof that Jesus actually lived on this earth. The Bible's not the only source of information about Jesus. And in fact, even after the church is established, Roman historians write about the effect Jesus Christ had on his followers in the church and what the church was doing. There's plenty of evidence that Jesus was a real person. No need to say he was a fictional character. But that just goes to show there are lots of opinions today, as there were in Jesus' day, about who Jesus is. And so we need to help with this identity. Who is Jesus? And so Jesus looks at his disciples and he says, well, who do you say that I am? And Peter, good old impetuous Peter, the one that was usually sticking his foot in his mouth when he said something because he'd said something not exactly right, got it right this time. Because he said, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. And Jesus said, you're right, Peter. And your name's to be blessed, because flesh and blood didn't reveal this to you, but my Father revealed this to you, who I am. And therefore, upon this rock, I will build my church. Now, some people today have a great misunderstanding of what Jesus said right there. Some people think Peter is the rock, because he named him Peter, which means a little pebble. You know, not even as big as a piece of gravel out here in the driveway. A little pebble. But the word rock, upon this rock I will build my church, means a gigantic boulder. So he wasn't talking about Peter being the one the church was built on, but the statement Peter made, you are the Christ, the Son of the living God. That's the foundation for the church. We've got to know who Jesus is. And in making this statement, Peter identifies Jesus as well as he identifies the office of Jesus as well as the divinity of Jesus. The office of Christhood emphasizes Jesus' humanity as the Son of David, but it also emphasizes his divinity because he's the answer to prophecy, that prophecy that Moses made before he died, and various other prophecies, like the prophecies throughout Isaiah and other prophecies scattered throughout the Old Testament to tell us who Jesus is. Now, why is it so important to get this right? Why is it so important to get this right? Well, it's important because we need to know who's going to be able to save us. All right? So in John chapter 14 and verse 6, Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through me. All right? That's important. You want to get to the Father? You got to know how to get there. You got to go through Jesus. Peter says in Acts chapter 4 and verse 12, he says, "There is salvation in no one else, for there is no other name given under heaven whereby men must be saved." There's no other way to be saved. There's only one way. Now people get offended sometimes we say that. All right? I'm sorry. I didn't say that. Jesus did. Okay? So I'm not apologizing for what Jesus said, and I'm not going to apologize when I quote him. There is one way, no other way, to get to heaven except through Jesus Christ. And we've got to take the gospel to the whole world. I know there are a lot of people out there who don't believe in him, and there are a lot of good people out there who don't believe in him. But we've got to share Jesus with them. We've got to let them know they can't go to heaven without him. Romans chapter 10, verses 8 through 10 says, "The word is near you in your mouth and in your heart. That is the word of faith that we proclaim. Because if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. For with the heart one believes and is justified, and with the mouth one confesses and is saved." So if Jesus is the Christ, the Messiah, the anointed one, then he must be the prophet that Moses predicted about in Deuteronomy 18. He must be the priest that intercedes on our behalf according to Hebrews 2 and Hebrews 5. And he must be the King of Kings that rules over us in Revelation 17:14. Why then is it so hard for people to acknowledge Christ? Why? Well, just think about it this way. Even though Peter said the right words, did Peter understand what he said? Now I raise that question because what follows, Jesus tells Peter and the other apostles, don't tell anyone. Don't tell anyone. Now wait a minute. If he is the Christ, and he's the Messiah, and he's the King of Kings, and he's the prophet, and he's the high priest, if he is all those things, why didn't he want Peter and the other apostles to tell him? Because Peter and the other apostles had the wrong idea who Jesus was. Peter and the other apostles thought that Jesus was going to set up his throne in Jerusalem and that he was going to rule and overthrow Rome from Jerusalem. Jesus never said that. Jesus never taught that. Jesus is all of those things that we talked about, but even his own apostles had their own preconceptions and wrong ideas and did not understand who Jesus was. And he didn't want them spreading misinformation. That's why it's so important that we understand what we're talking about. Who Jesus is. He is the Christ. He is the Son of God. He is the Messiah. He is the high priest. He is the King of Kings. He is the Lord of Lords. And we need to know what that means to carry that identity. Because then we need to understand his mission. In verse 21, chapter 16, he tells the mission. And from that time Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things from the elders and chief priests and scribes and be killed and be raised on the third day. Jesus had to teach them what his mission was before they could go out and tell people who he was. Because of their misconception. Because of their false ideas. And so many people today still have false ideas of who Jesus is. And so we understand who he is, then we understand what he had to do. He needed to teach them that the Messiah needs to be associated with the suffering servant found in Isaiah 53. If you haven't read Isaiah 53 lately, go back and read Isaiah 53. It sounds like Isaiah was standing at the cross with what he has to say about Jesus. God revealed all those things so that those people would understand who the Messiah was when he came. They must not have gone back and read it. Exactly right. They had their preconception. But we've got to have God's understanding so that we can understand the mission of what he came for. I mean, very early in his ministry, Jesus hinted at what was going to happen. In John 2:19, Jesus said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I'll rise it up again." Now, they thought he was talking about Herod's temple that had taken over 46 years to build and it still wasn't complete. That wasn't what he was talking about. He was talking about his own body. In John chapter 3, verse 14, as he's talking to Nicodemus, Jesus says, "And as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, so must the Son of Man be lifted up." And you remember that story about Moses lifting up the serpent? Remember there was a plague and God sent snakes into the camp, and anybody who was bitten by one of those snakes was killed instantly. And Moses lifted up a bronze serpent on a pole, and anybody who got bitten out and looked at that serpent was saved. Jesus said, just like Moses lifted up that serpent, so must the Son of Man be lifted up. We need to look to the sacrifice Jesus made on the cross of Calvary, because he paid the debt for our sins. That was his mission. That's why he came. In Matthew chapter 12 and verse 40, Jesus said that just as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of that great fish, so shall the Son of Man be in the belly of the earth. Talking about his resurrection. Because remember, after 3 days, Jonah came out of that great fish. Whatever that fish was that God made to teach Jonah a lesson. And they put Jesus in the ground on Friday. And on Sunday morning early, Jesus was up and out of that tomb. Jesus had been teaching them and teaching them these things so that they would know who he was. And he taught them that he had to be the propitiation for all of our sins. We don't have time to read these verses today, but jot them down. Romans 3:25, 1 John 2:2, 1 John 4:10. All of those talk about Jesus being the propitiation. Now that's a big word, big Bible word. And sometimes people don't understand those big Bible words. What it means is that he had to die in our place. That's the whole idea behind it. He took our place. He made atonement. And you could take that word atonement and break it down a little bit, because that's another one of them big Bible words that sometimes people get confused about. You can break that word atonement down to at one ment. Jesus made it possible for us to have fellowship with God by being the propitiation, or the sacrifice, the one that was willing to die in our place. Now, as Jesus begins to explain this again, that he was going to suffer many things and be killed, and on the third day he'd be raised, we find Peter again. This time Peter doesn't have the right words, even though he had just confessed who Jesus was. It had just come out of his mouth. And now Jesus begins to explain what his mission is, and Peter says, oh no, we're not going to let that happen. Nobody's going to hurt you. We'll die first. And even the night Jesus was arrested, remember, it was Peter. He was there, and he had his sword ready. He was trying to defend. He cut off the ear of the high priest's servant. And Jesus was looking and said, Peter, put that thing away. Picked up that ear and healed that man's ear. Peter didn't understand what he said, and now he's trying to get in the way of Jesus fulfilling his mission. Because, folks, understand something. Jesus was tempted. All right? That's a hard thing for our minds to grasp and understand. But the Bible tells us he was tempted. One of the things he was tempted about was not going to the cross. How do I know that? Because back in Matthew chapter 4, if you've been reading Matthew this week, you remember back in chapter 4, Satan had 3 temptations. One of them was that you're hungry, turn these stones into bread. And Jesus said, man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word of God. Then he took him to the temple, to the highest point on the temple, and said, go ahead, jump off. You jump off, and the angels are going to catch you, because God said that the angels will not let you dash your foot on a stone. And Jesus comes back again, quoting Scripture, you shall not tempt the Lord your God. Then Satan took him to a high mountain. It might have been Mount Hermon. Is that about one of the highest mountains in that area? Took him to a high mountain and said, look around. That'd be a good place to look around and see everything. Just look around. If you just simply bow down and worship me, I'll give you all that. And Jesus said, you shall worship the Lord your God, and him only shall you serve. Satan tempted him to forego the cross and let Satan do it. Some people say, how did Satan do that? Well, he is the prince of the power of the air. He's the prince of this world. That's why there's so much evil in this world. He is the prince of this world. He has a lot to do with what goes on in this world. Jesus said, no, but those were the temptations. Now, Peter, oh no, we're going to defend you. Satan done jumped into Peter and was trying to throw Jesus off. That's what happened. All right? In the garden, you ever thought about it? Jesus sweat like great drops of blood. Why? What did he pray? If there is any other way. He was tempted not to go through with the cross. And here Peter's not helping him. He's been struggling with this temptation all along. And Peter's not helping him at all with his mission. What about us? Are we helping Jesus with his mission? Because let me tell you, if you're not with God and his plan, you're on the opposing side. Jesus looked at Peter and said, get behind me, Satan. He called Peter Satan because Satan was directing what Peter had to say. Get behind me, Satan. If our mind's not on the things of God, then our minds are on the things of Satan. That's why we have to be renewed by the transforming of our mind. To keep those good thoughts in our mind. To understand God's will. And it may be hard sometimes. But when we focus on God's will, we're always going to be at peace. And that's what we've got to do. Focus on God's will so that we can be at peace. But then Jesus issued a call in verse 24. Jesus said, if anyone wishes to come after me, he must deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. See, if we're going to grasp who Jesus is as our leader, then we need to be willing to follow. If he is indeed the Messiah, if he is the King of Kings, then we have to be willing to do whatever he asks us to do. And what he asked us to do was deny ourselves. Take up our cross and follow him. Take up our cross and follow him. In some cases, that might mean to die like Jesus died. Peter finally understood all of those things. We all know that. Peter was a great apostle, delivered the first gospel message to the Jews on the day of Pentecost and then to the Gentiles later. But Peter made his way to Rome. Peter was imprisoned in Rome. Peter was executed in Rome. Crucified. But not worthy to be like Jesus. He asked him to crucify him upside down. He gave his life. There are lots of people today in other countries around the world that risk their life just by confessing the name of Jesus. So sometimes it might be that we have to give up our life for Jesus. That may be what he's called us to do. But for others, it's just serving him even when it's not a popular thing. You know, we have to give Jesus our very best. And giving Jesus our very best means everything we have. It means our life. Because the way we live our life is the way we worship Jesus. So it might be giving him our life. It might be giving him our finances. You know, everything we have belongs to him anyway. So when he just asks for a tenth of it back, he's not asking for a lot. And if Christians would learn just to tithe, just that much, just to tithe, the church would never have a problem. It's important that we understand what he's calling us to give. It's not necessarily standing up here and preaching a sermon, but all of us are called to be evangelists and carry the gospel message to our families, to the people we work with, to our friends. We all have that responsibility. And we're all going to have to give account of whether or not we're doing those things. It's important that we understand. Jesus said if we are faithful unto the point of death, he will give us the crown of life. That's what we all want, isn't it? Isn't that what we're supposed to be working for? The crown of life. So it's important we understand who he is. It's important to understand what he did. It's important to understand what he's calling us to do. Because if he indeed is the Messiah, and I believe he is, there's nothing more important than serving him. Jesus said, what would a man profit if he forfeits his own soul to gain the whole world? What's the world going to profit? Nothing. oh, it looks good at first, fame. Well, all of those different things look nice and look good, but with those things come a lot of headaches. What does Jesus have to offer? Heaven. Streets paved with gold, the gates of heaven with pearls, the foundation made out of 12 precious gems. But even that doesn't matter, because heaven is where Jesus is, and Jesus is the light, and there will never be any darkness there, because Jesus is the light. He indeed is the Messiah, and because He is the Messiah, we have to learn to follow His will and do what He's asked us to do. Deny ourselves, take up our cross, and follow Him. So what's your response? What's your response? You heard the call. How are you going to respond? Verification is always trusting that this thing you say. You have to say, Jesus, and what's your promise? Always